Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest of our interviews with the candidates for this year's Green Party executive elections. Before we go any further, I just have one thing to ask of you, which is that you scroll down right now and hit that subscribe button. It means that you won't miss any of the interviews we've got coming up with the other candidates, any of the videos that we're putting out in the future. It won't cost you a penny, and it helps Bright Green out a massive deal as well. So make sure you go down and hit that subscribe button now. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our interviewee for this evening. I'm delighted to be joined by the candidate for Policy Development Coordinator, Vix Lowthion. Vix, how are you doing this evening?
Good, thanks. Thanks, Chris.
Great to have you with us. So I'm going to start you off with hopefully a very easy question, which is just why are you standing to be the Green Party's next Policy Development Coordinator?
Yeah, that is a sort of easy question, but also a very important question. I've been doing this role for the last 10 months, and I think that I've learned an awful lot in the last 10 months about what needs to be done to take it forward. I haven't had much of a chance in order to put some of these plans into operation, and I really think that we need to be taking policy a lot more seriously as a party, and they're starting to see GPEX and the staffing understand that. So really, I've been starting to lay the foundations, and I want to take it forward for the next couple of years.
So what's your vision for how policy development work should happen within the party, how the party should be in its kind of best form producing policy?
Yeah, well, policy should be produced by conference, and in order to do that, it needs a strategy in order to make sure that the policy that we're putting forward at conference is as strong, is as robust, is as well documented, is as scientific, is as well consulted on as possible, and that's one of the things that Policy Development Committee does. But there are a whole host of other ways in which we can improve policy development in terms of the actual system of policy development, and also the support that we give to the policy working groups, who are really the engine that are driving this forward. So the title of the GPEX executive role is Policy Development Coordinator, and it really is a coordinating role to bring together all those different threads, looking at the short term, the next conference, but also a much longer term, which is what I want to be able to do in the next sort of 3 to 5 year cycle.
So a lot of our viewers, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well, will have been to conference, will have heard the promise of this fully democratic, participatory policy-making process, and in recent years will have very much not seen that realised. In recent years we've had discussions that have been going on over several days about constitutional issues, people utilising the process in order to filibuster, so things that they don't want to hear don't get heard, or else using the kind of procedural tactics to try and manoeuvre their way to get their way at conference. What improvements would you like to see about the kind of way in which policy is made at conference, and also about the kind of democratic culture within the party and how that relates to policy making?
Okay, not small questions though, Chris. Yeah, I mean, I can put forward what I would like to see changed about those things, and you're spot on in acknowledging at least the last 2 conferences that we've had, which have been mostly online, which should be democratizing and engaging, but unfortunately I don't think have been the best window into the workings of our party on that. Now, the rules and the standing orders which we're conducting it in are not something that comes under the remit, unfortunately, of Policy Development Committee. So although I can have particular, as you've identified, particular perceptions about that, the influence that I can have, or that the Policy Development Committee can have over that, is somewhat limited. I think what we must do, and I've been talking a lot with the GPRC co-chairs on this, what we must do is Policy Development Committee must look at a whole broad spectrum of policies for us to discuss and debate and to energise on. So I think, as you indicate, when we're discussing the minutiae of conference reports, that really should be separate, I think, from the policy focus that conference should be, and perhaps that should be at separate times in order for conference to actually be a democratic way of organising policy. I think that also links with being more strategic, and by that I don't mean that policy development committee should decide what policies we should discuss. Those have to be put forward by the membership, but there are certain policy areas, and you can see that in the huge amount of enabling motions. I think I've counted 9 that are being put forward, or ones which could be classed as enabling motions, to look at and to develop certain areas. So let's just take Europe, for instance, where our policy is vastly outdated now due to Brexit. These things can somewhat get put down the line in terms of development. So this is where Policy Development Committee need to put forward the strategy, the wider strategy, to make sure that all of these things are looked at, not just 5 or 6. In order to get through stuff, that's where accreditation is really important. And I know that has been particularly controversial. So in terms of how the standing orders for the conduct of conference are interpreted, if that makes sense, there are certain criteria that accreditation needs to meet. And I know there's some people that were concerned about that at the last conference. So we are re-clarifying exactly what we mean by that in order to look at the, let's say 20 odd policies that have been put forward. So I think accreditation should make it a lot straightforward, and we owe a lot to the 2 Sams for putting forward that accreditation, Sam Ritchie's and Sam Pancheri, which seems like years ago, but that should really make conference going a lot smoother than it does, in order to not fast track, but effectively be able to say that these policies are important and robust enough and meet the strategic needs of the party. And that, I think, when we look at these policy areas such as Europe, natural resources, constitutional assembly, tax and public finance, we need to prioritise rights and responsibilities. So be much more strategic in that regard. That's quite a long answer.
No, that's great, and it actually kind of leads quite well on to what I wanted to ask you next, which is around the issue of accreditation. So some of our viewers will be well aware of the accreditation process that the party has for policy. Others will be less aware. So just to give people some background, the Policy Development Committee has the ability to accredit certain motions that have met a certain set of criteria, which basically demonstrates that policy has gone through a sort of rigorous development process, whereby various people who have knowledge, interests, etc. in the policy are consulted on it. And what it means is that Policy Development Committee doesn't say endorse the policy or take a view on whether or not it should pass, but when a proposal is put forward to conference, it allows for a separate space for accredited motions to be debated first, so that the ones that have theoretically been through the most rigorous process are the ones that conference prioritizes. Now, you've mentioned there's been controversy around the accreditation process in the past, and that comes from a number of different angles. I think different people within the party, different groups in the party have raised concerns about that process. And you've mentioned that there's going to be a clarification coming out. How do you want to see that accreditation process improved so that it's used to really for its purpose, which is to make sure that party policy is as evidence-based and as rigorous as it can be?
Yeah, so I think first of all, we need to be quite clear, exactly like you started to touch on there. Accreditation does not mean that we say that these policies should be passed. Accreditation just means that they have been consulted. So they have consulted groups, not that they seek approval of particular groups, for instance. So the criteria in the Constitution say that the policy should be endorsed by a group. That could be a liberation group, it could be a policy working group, it could be another important recognised group within the party. However, I think we had a situation, didn't we, where there was that was adhered to, but it wasn't necessarily a group that was directly relevant to the policy that was suggested. So we're going to Policy Development Committee, our meeting on Monday, specifically to look at that accreditation criteria, so we can be very, very clear what we are meaning before the meeting of accreditation, which will happen at the end of August, if that makes sense. So to be clear on how we're interpreting it before we sit down to the meeting, because I think that's really important. We can't do that then. It also talks about consultation within and out with the party. So within the party, consultation could be putting it up on green spaces and a couple of people commenting. That's not robust enough, I don't feel, to be something that should be accredited by the party if it's just being posted somewhere. So again, looking at endorsement, looking at consultation, looking at whether it meets your strategic needs. And this is why I've been going to political committee, PolCom, which is a meeting which is I think it's chaired by the leadership, and it has representatives from elected Greens, from spokespeople from the liberation groups, from equality and diversity, the disability groups. It has a whole host, the House of Lords, the House of Commons, on this group, and they should be indicating to us what the strategic needs of the party are, not Policy Development Committee deciding what those strategic needs are. The interpretation of that, whether, if you think of a controversial, I'll just take one off the top of my head that hasn't been looked at by Policy Development Committee yet, but if you take HS2, how do we decide what is in the strategic benefit of the party there? Is that the policy we currently have, which is to say that HS2 is wrong, or is it to look at high-speed rail as being to be able to take the capacity off the roads and therefore reduce carbon emissions? Which of those is in the strategic need of the party? So I envisage that accreditation will involve more discussions with policy committee about what the subjects are that are coming up, so we can seek that advice rather than being left to very well-meaning and very committed members of Policy Development Committee, but they may not be representative of the whole strategy of the entire party. We have a political strategy, which is how we're going to get Greens elected, how we're going to run the finances of the party, how we're going to grow our party. But we don't have a policy strategy, which is which policies do we want to develop? Which ones do we want to put forward to the electorate to gain the most support? So in the absence of that policy strategy, which I've been to GPEX and I've spoken at PolCom about, talking to the different stakeholders. In the absence of that at the moment for autumn conference, I think that we need to take some form of advice from policy committee, or at least the leadership team, on what they feel about those accreditations. So that's what I mean by the 4 criteria. And that's why we need to be quite clear on that as Policy Development Committee, because we can only work within that criteria that we're given at the moment, unless we want to seek further change.
Thanks. I think a lot of people will be reassured to hear that things are in motion to improve that accreditation process. Yeah. I guess one, you talked there a little bit about, in terms of the consultation process, about how previously there's been concerns about groups in the party being consulted and that being ticked off the consultation process, but the policy area wasn't relevant to them. I wondered a little bit about the issue around the out with or the external consultation, and to kind of draw this out, maybe touch on the HS2 issue that you mentioned, because it'd be very easy, I think, for a group of people who wanted to change the party's policy on HS2 to consult with the owners of private rail companies, the rail industry more broadly, and say they've done external consultation with relevant bodies and therefore they should be accredited. The flip side of that would say, well, you haven't spoken to conservation groups or environmental groups or anti-aviation campaigners or anything like that to get that kind of holistic consultation. So how do you envisage Policy Development Committee being able to make meaningful judgments as to whether that consultation is sufficient, and is that something that should be being done, or is that at the moment, because the way I see it at the moment, there's an obvious loophole for people to be able to consult with people that agree with their position anyway?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen similar to that with previous policies that have been put forward for accreditation that have got background information and support from outside the party, but other people would see that support as being very subjective. Totally agree on that. And I think this is where I think the party needs to be clearer that accreditation is not endorsement. It's not Policy Development Committee saying we recommend you pass this. That's what fast tracking would be, for enabling motions or for, minor textual amendments would be fast tracking. The SOC and Policy Development Committee all agree that this is something which should not create any controversy. But HS2 as one, obviously gender as another one. These are issues which can be quite divisive, well, are divisive for a number of members within our party. And therefore, it needs to be quite clear that Policy Development Committee are not endorsing these. We're saying that they should be discussed. And that should be discussed and voted down on, should be discussed and voted for. I suppose what you're putting forward there is that, and this has been alluded to many times, about background papers and background papers being available for members to peruse. And I suppose what we did with the only accreditation I've looked at in my time, which was Spring Conference, we didn't put forward the list what the documents are that we looked at for each policy that we accredited. So this is really useful conversation, Chris, to make sure that even if there isn't a specific background paper, because sometimes the documents come in like a folder digital form rather than one PDF, as it were, that we should, when we're listing which ones are accredited, we should put, if there's out with background evidence support, who those people are that they've consulted. So if it is HS2 and they've consulted with Great Western Rail and the government and various things, then people know that it's been subjective. But yeah, it's not an endorsement. It's not an endorsement. It's just there to make sure that the policies which have had the most time, have taken the most care, have taken the widest consultation, have been developed the most robustly, have the most support from bodies within the party, that they are heard. Because if we have 20, 25 policies to discuss, we're never going to be able to get around to them. So the accredited policies are the ones we discuss first. They're not the ones that we endorse as a policy development committee. I know that's quite, I think that probably needs to be made a lot clearer, and maybe if we posted who is providing the evidence and people could see that it was subjective, it's not our decision to make as to whether this policy should be discussed or not. It's for conference to decide whether it should be agreed or not.
So I wanted to move away a little bit from the kind of confines of the policy development coordinator role, because in the election that's coming up, or that's happening now, actually, people won't just be voting for you or for the candidates in other races for the specific role in which they are standing in. They'll also be voting for you as a member of the wider executive that will be making decisions on a whole host of things beyond your kind of individual portfolio. So I wanted to ask some kind of slightly broader questions. And the one I wanted to start with was, what do you think are the biggest opportunities and challenges that are facing the Green Party right now?
Oh, okay. I think bringing the party together is probably the number one priority, and an immediate term for our party going forward, as a force that it should be. I think that's a lot to do with the pandemic, I think, in the fact that we have reverted a lot. I don't mean reverted in a negative way, but we spent a lot of our time having discussions via Twitter or having discussions via, small chunks of text rather than meeting each other in person. And I don't just mean that as a national party, but also for many local parties. The focus has not been on what we have in common rather than what divides us. And I'm hoping that once we start to meet in person at conference, or once we start to meet in person in the local communities, that some of these, it upsets me. It really upsets me. And I find it very difficult to see how we can gain the achievements that we need to gain whilst we spend an awful lot of our energies debating things that sometimes I don't feel should be debated personally, especially when we're looking at, for me, looking at trans and non-binary issues. I think that just to affirm that, you know, trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binary identities are valid. This is a fundamental to me, and I am upset that we are spending time looking at what divides us, like those issues, rather than ones which bring us together. And I think that GPECs are a really important part of that. Although it's GPRC who are looking at the well-being of the party, it's GPECs which are putting a lot of these things into action, and have the capacity to take that action in terms of staffing, in terms of resources and money. So I think that's the number one priority for our party at the moment, is bringing everybody together. And I think that if GPECs, as the elected representatives, directly elected by the whole membership, can behave in a way which is conducive to talking and listening and leading by example, then I think that's really, really important. It's a very big issue, and it's not one that I think I can resolve personally. But I'm looking forward to working with, if I'm elected, that is, against reopen nominations. I'm looking forward to seeing new members on GPECs and seeing how this may well change the way in which it's operating. I mean, I personally have had a largely positive time on GPECs, apart from the most recent weeks, and I felt that most people have been, you know, respectful and collegiate, but I can see how a misfunctioning GPECs is a misfunctioning party. The two of them are combined.
So what you've kind of raised there is something that I wanted to pick up with you, which is you've mentioned, I guess, the last few weeks being challenging for you on GPECs. You've mentioned divisions in the party, and you've mentioned the specific issue around trans rights. And I guess these elections are taking place in a point when the party's in, I would describe it diplomatically as a state of turmoil. You know, we've just had, in the last 2 or 3 months, you've had 3 members of GPECs resign from their position, some of them specifically around the issue of trans rights. We had Jonathan Bartley resigning from his post as co-leader. He's now no longer in post. And Sian Berry saying that she wouldn't be standing in the upcoming by-election, and specifically citing the issue around trans rights as the reason why, and the appointment of certain spokespeople for that. Now, you've been on the executive for the last 10 months. You've experienced some of these conversations and tensions firsthand. I wondered if you could reflect a little bit about a little bit more about what you think the cause of the issue is there, not just in relation to the trans rights issue, but more broadly around the tension on the executive and elsewhere in the party. But also, I guess specifically, you've talked there about wanting to bring the party together. What do you see that looking like in practice when, you know, you've said quite clearly there that it's a fundamental that, you know, the party is a party that supports LGBT rights. And there are some people in the party that are spending the vast majority of their time trying to overturn the party's positions on LGBT rights. So how do you square that circle, and how do you bring those people together?
Yeah, okay. I suppose to allude to something like that, I guess we give the impression that maybe everybody on GPECs all knows what's going on at all hours of every day. Maybe that's true for some members of GPECs, but I don't feel very much in the loop with some of the things that's going on. When you talk about some of those issues, I don't have any much more detail on many of those issues than you've just done in that introduction to this topic. Perhaps that is to the benefit for my mental health, because I think the more I find out about some of these things, the more concerned that I am. To go into how we can move forward, I think that the situation that we're in with some of that, and you describe it as a party in turmoil, I suppose for those of us which get involved in reading the media and the social media and the chats and so on, that it is. I think outside of those of us that interact with the party very closely, and that's a small percentage, isn't it? It's a small percentage of our party that get involved in internal elections. A frighteningly small percentage of a party that get involved in internal elections. So although we can see it as a party in turmoil, I think that's probably for the 15-20% of us that are very, very concerned about that. We have to remember that there are a number of people who've joined the Green Party, are involved in their local communities, who either can't or haven't been able to pay much attention to those things. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, that they are focusing on other issues. It may be that's the only way they can function with their life. I think what I've learned just in the last 6 weeks, and I suppose I haven't changed from that, is I think process is really important. And I think we would all agree on GPEX that process is really important. And I think there are some things that have happened that have not been great in terms of process. So for instance, we recently looked at where our target seats would be as GPEX, and a report was written, interviews were had, and it was delivered to GPEX to look at and to approve. That didn't happen with spokespeople. And I think that it should have happened, because I think then we may not be in the position that we are now. Saying that, I also think that process is important. And if you are a member of the party and you have not been censured or removed from that, then you are the same as other members of the party, even though I may not necessarily agree with what you say. So perhaps process is important in terms of looking at that before we get to the position of looking at spokespeople. It's very difficult, and I sound like I know much more than I'm talking about. But I think that what we've learned in the last 6 weeks, I think, is process is important and consultation is important, even if, and we should acknowledge that, and be open about times when we have not done things in the way which would be for the best of the party, even if we don't all agree with those things. I think that if a collegiate body has made that decision, then that's one thing. But if a small group have made that decision, that's a different matter, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So I'm going to move on slightly from the kind of internal facing stuff and talk a little bit about the party's external facing. So obviously in the last 18 months, 2 years, the kind of political space in the UK has changed quite dramatically. We have the Tory party moving further to the right, becoming more authoritarian. We have, Labour shifting its position wildly since Keir Starmer's leadership. Who really knows what the Lib Dems position is on anything, but they exist. But nonetheless, the politics is changing. How do you think the Greens should be responding to that? And specifically, where do you think the Greens should be placing ourselves politically in the coming years?
I think the biggest strength for a lot of what the Greens have been saying is that we have not necessarily moved position. I think you're right. If everything else is moving position in the Greens, because we've got our policies, which are democratically decided by conference, and conference is only twice a year, those policies are not subject to rapid change. Our leadership may be changing. People that are elected to GPEX may be changing, and people that are working active in their local parties may well do, but the policies don't. You can't necessarily look at all the other political parties and decide, well, how are we going to move in relation to those? Because what we should be doing is remaining true to our values and true to the needs of the climate and the needs of the population on the planet as well. And because we haven't shifted around, this is why I believe this is why we see, although it's a small growth, but we see a growth to the point where we are, regularly 6-7% in the polls, although that's vanishingly tiny in terms of the emergency that's facing us. But I wouldn't want to see us shift. I think that every area, every region of the Green Party, every local party, every street, every small community, the Greens appeal to different people. politically. And I think that is really important, because we don't very explicitly position ourselves in some form of political spectrum, which I would argue is becoming less and less important to the public, because the culture war isn't on a spectrum. The culture war is just awful. It's not, it's in a way, it's a binary thing. That's either a really good thing or not a really good thing. And I think that we have to very clearly put ourselves on one or the other on there, rather than on some sort of spectrum. But here on the Isle of Wight and in our rural communities and places we've done really well in, and the Blue Wall, I saw the report, the Greens are doing well, because they're taking votes off Conservatives. And if we're going to see massive change, that's what we have to do. Because the Conservative voters aren't the bad guys, it's the Conservatives that are the bad guys. And if we're able to get our message across to Conservative voters, and we do that through staying true to our values rather than having a particular label, then that's what's effective.
So just to follow up on that a little bit. So you talked there about, the Greens message appealing in different ways to people in different communities, whether it be rural or urban, or different wards in an area, or indeed different roads, as you say. I guess the question I wanted to put to you in relation to that is, obviously, political parties build electoral coalitions based on different portions of the population. And what you've described to me there sometimes rings alarm bells, because it reminds me of what the Liberal Democrats used to do, which is to try and be everything to everyone. And in one place they would be saying one thing, and down the road they'd be saying another. And then, of course, what we saw in 2010 is that they did particularly well in an election, got into government, and then they alienated everyone by what they were then implementing, because they'd been saying the complete opposite of that on the doorstep in certain areas. And so what you described there rings alarm bells in terms of the long-term prospects of the party, and I wondered if you could correct me on that.
Yeah, no, I think it's the opposite of that, because you're staying true to the policies rather than shifting your messaging. I think I'm talking about labelling. So if you are labelling yourself as I'm trying to think, if you're labelling yourself as a party which is how would we label ourselves as a party? Because I think it's very difficult to label ourselves as a membership. I think our membership is incredibly diverse. And I think to a certain extent, that's our strength. I think you're right in that you can't promise one thing to people in one area and promise another thing to the other people. But we have those policies, and we can't change those policies. They've been there. Well, we can change them, obviously, at conference, but they're very clear. People can find them. We can't shift around what they are. Saying that, we've got people, if we take HS2 again, we've got people in different communities who want to say different things. And we don't have a whip, as it were, when we have our elected councillors who are saying those things. I suppose I'm not making things very clear, in a way. I'm making things seem much more complex than they are. But I don't think that we should label ourselves in a way in order to try and attract Corbyn supporters, or label ourselves in order to attract Liberal Democrat supporters. I think we should just concentrate on being ourselves and focusing on social justice, and focusing on greater equality, and focusing on climate change. I don't think that trying to chase after particular groups, because as you point out already, those particular groups are very diverse. People are politically homeless. Remainers are politically homeless. People who supported Corbyn and wanted great social change and equality are politically homeless. These are a diverse group of people, and I don't think we can just chase after one of those group of people. I think we've got to remain firm with our own beliefs. So I suppose it's the opposite of what I would suggest the Lib Dems would do. So
I've got one final kind of serious question, and I've got a couple of slightly more flippant ones to finish off on. Okay. So my last serious question is, where do you think that the Green Party is going right, and where do you think it's going wrong strategically at the moment?
Well, where it's going right is clearly in a way that we're getting local support in elections. You know, whatever we're doing, whether that's through our strategy, whether that's through getting really good people to come and join the party and stand as councillors where they wouldn't have joined the Greens before, whether that's engaging local people to go out there and leaflet and door knock. At a local point of view, we're doing well. At a national point of view and an international, with COP26 coming, we're not. And we see that in what's going on in the world in the last couple of weeks, isn't it? It's either massive flooding or fires or, you know, huge climate indications of the climate emergency, and we're not tackling that at all because we're not getting any traction at a national level. We're getting Conservatives such as Elga Stratton telling people to vote for the Green Party, but then she is talking about flying aeroplanes and don't mince things before the dishwasher, and this is massively out of touch with the people as well as out of touch with the planet. We must treat national and international influence as a big priority, because if we can just get some local councillors elected in towns and cities across the country, that's not going to change things until we change a government at Westminster or we change and influence international leaders. You know, it's that urgent, isn't it? And we can see that now. You know, even the news at 10 for the BBC last week said, you know, headline news, climate change is actually happening. Well, slow hand clap to the BBC for leading on that in 2021, when it's more and more difficult to take action on there. The thing that annoys me more than anything is when we're told to, you know, recycle some stuff and, you know, don't use the dishwasher and have only half a shower a day. This is not the systemic change that needs to be made on an urgent level. So the needs for the Green Party are having influence are much bigger than they've ever been before, and yet we're nowhere near having those number of MPs, those number of people in the House of Lords, those number of people, you know, at the London Assembly, that on the bigger stages, the most influential stages. And at COP26, I'm really hoping that we can join together as the global Greens and have much more of an influence, because it's a dire situation that we're facing.
I promised I'd finish on slightly less serious notes. So the first of my less serious questions are, what's your favourite and what's your least favourite Green Party policy?
That's serious. My favourite Green Party policies would have to be the education ones, because they're the ones that I use as the education spokesperson on a daily basis, and the ones which I see more and more people posting about them, getting rid of testing, having local accountability of schools, you know, putting children's needs first and foremost, you know, looking at skills and lifelong learning. Education policies are definitely the most important ones. Least important policies.
Least favourite. So
least favourite.
Anything you disagree with in particular, or that you think needs a real overhaul? You can't just say the Europe policy, because we know that's totally out of date. But
the ones which need a massive overhaul, I suppose. In terms of the enabling motions that are coming forward, the ones which I think really need looking at more than anywhere else is the rights and responsibilities chapter. And I think that needs looking at more than anywhere else, because it has just been added to, and without a holistic look at it. And so we then have people not being very clear where we stand when it comes to rights and responsibilities. And I don't just mean on terms of gender identity there, but I mean a whole, or sexuality. I think a whole host of the human rights and responsibilities and the way in which they interplay with each other. So I think that is the area that needs the most looking at, not because I think that our philosophy is wrong there, but I think that there is a big opportunity to be much clearer and bolder and bring it up to 21st century scratch, because some of those things have been in the policy list for a long time, and it links into the core principles and stuff as well. And we can't just leave things, we need to revisit them, even if just to say that's good stuff. So that's the area that I want to see change, or definitely looking at more important than any other area.
And finally, who in the Green Party inspires you the most?
Ooh, who in the Green Party inspires me the most? I would say that in the last 12 months, the person in the Green Party that I've been most excited by and energised by would be Cleo Lake. I want to see more of Cleo, please, because she is putting forward views and her energy and her principles that we don't hear enough of in our party on a big national platform. So yeah, more of Cleo, please.
I'm sure Cleo will be thrilled to hear it. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Vix.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
So thank you as well to everyone who has watched the whole of this interview, and to everyone who's watched any of our others. If you haven't yet had a chance to watch them, please do go and check them out now. We've got I think half a dozen up now, and they're all on our YouTube channel, so check them out. The best way to make sure that you don't miss any future interviews is to go down, hit that subscribe button, and make sure you get all of Bright Green's updates as we go forward. I have a few final bits of admin and things to remind you about before we leave. The first is Vix and I have discussed a lot of things this evening. If there's anything that you agree with, anything that you disagree with, let us know in the comments down below. Get a conversation started down there. Two final things. Firstly, just to say that as many of you will know, Bright Green is an independent media outlet. We unfortunately, or rather fortunately, don't have billionaire backings or big money, big business donors. We rely exclusively on the kind and generous donations of people like you. If you're able to, we encourage people to set up a donation of just £5 a month. It means that we can bring you more of these videos. It means that we can bring more articles, analysis, comment, news on Green parties in the UK, on the Labour movement, social movements, and the rest of the left as well. So please do head to bright-green.org/donate and set up a regular donation. It will make a massive difference. And the final thing for me to tell you is, if you're a member of the Green Party of England and Wales, voting is currently open, unless you're watching this sort of 3 years later and you've stumbled across it on YouTube. But voting is now open. It will be open to the end of August. So make sure you get your votes in and vote for your new executive. It's been an absolute pleasure to be with you this evening. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all very, very soon.